Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome once again to the SportsPro Podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. Hope you're well and looking forward to the latest instalment of our coverage of Uefa Euro 2020. We're going to be looking at the host cities this week and the event strategy element of the whole affair. And to take us through some of that, we have Kirsten Sibbit-Johnston, an Associate Director at the Sports Consultancy. Hello, Kirsten.
Hi, Eoin.
The Sports Consultancy, of course, have a long history, among other things, of working with rights holders and destinations on event strategies. We're going to be hearing a little bit later from the host side. We've got Paul Bush, the Director of Events at EventScotland, giving the perspective of one of the Euro 2020 hosts to our digital editor, Tom Bassam. That's coming up in part two. But yeah, as things stand at UEFA Euro 2020, the first round is about over. We're going to be saying goodbye to a few teams and beginning to say farewell as well in the next few days to some of the host venues. So this seems like an opportune moment to reflect on what those hosts will have got out of the tournament and how everyone involved might be reflecting on this grand experiment of an 11-nation major event. Kirsten, there's a lot to unpack, but let's think about where some of these cities will have been a couple of weeks ago, and certainly how they will have been thinking over the last few years. How will they have scaled their involvement in this tournament? What will their perspective be on it? I mean, if you are a Glasgow or a Budapest or one of the cities who are hosting games, are you looking at this as a small event, or are you looking at it as you're part of this big tapestry of a mega event? How can you frame it? What's the most productive way of doing that?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, they'll certainly be conscious that it's part of a larger tournament, and it's still the Euros, and it's still one of the biggest events in Europe and in the world, which is something that will be contributing to the benefit and the impact that they'll be receiving. But I think, yeah, it's an interesting model because it is, in terms of what they're hosting, it's a relatively limited part of that much bigger event, unless you're say London, who's got obviously the two semi-finals and the final, as well as a number of group games. And I think that will have impacted the level of investment that people will be putting into it. I mean, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, throughout this podcast and this conversation, is the pros and cons of this model and this approach. And one of the things that I'd be interested to learn a bit more about is how much investment cities have been making in and around the tournament. I think whilst you might only be hosting, say, 3 or 4 matches, I think the minimum is maybe 4 matches, you will still need to deal with the clean venue, the venue dressing, everyone's still putting on a fan zone, albeit with social distancing. So there's still a minimum standard that all the venues are going to have to adhere to fit with UEFA's rules. But whilst if you were hosting a whole tournament and a whole Euros, you'd be thinking about how do we really leverage this event to generate significant benefit for the sport in our country, for participation, for players, particularly in things like social impact, volunteering. What is the wider impact this is having on our country and on our people? I'm not sure how much of that investment will be still taking place in an event where you're only involved in a small part of it. And I mean, part of that will be because of COVID and the limitations that has on what cities and hosts have been able to do, what FAs have been able to do, things like programs that you can deliver in and around a tournament. But then, I'm working with Danish FA at the moment, and there's certainly a real level of excitement there because Copenhagen wouldn't be, Denmark wouldn't be hosting the whole Euros by themselves in any real world. So an opportunity for them to host their own teams and I guess cheer them on to qualification yesterday. It is a big event, and it's a massive event on their calendar because they are part of one of the premium events that's happening this year. So I think it's an interesting dynamic, and I suppose the challenge that we've got in assessing this model and how well it's worked is that you can't separate COVID from the event model itself. We can't take out COVID and think, well, if there was no COVID, would this have been successful? How much would they have been investing? How would cities have been scaling their involvement in the tournament?
I think there's a few things that we'll probably go back over in the next kind of 20 minutes or so there. One being the appeal of small and medium-sized events to certain hosts, and particularly when you look at the profile of different cities involved in the Euro, and you have London and Munich who might expect, well, Munich is hosting games at the next Euro, I think in 2024, will be in Germany. Would have a pretty decent shot at staging the final. Wembley staged the Euro in 1996 in a different guise, etc., etc. There are potential tournament hosts in there, solo tournament hosts, and then there are those cities, Copenhagen, Glasgow, perhaps Budapest, perhaps, that you might not expect to be involved with an event of this scale. But let's just continue on this theme of how the preparations will have been handled, or how the expectations, I should say, will have been set. What are some of the measurements that are going to have been useful to hosts in understanding the economic impact of these games, understanding, the difference in exposure that staging a game within a bigger tournament has relative to, say, staging a Europa League final or something like that? How will they have approached this in the past few weeks?
I think, the economics is a tricky one, because I'm sure for many of these hosts, if not all of them, economic impact would have been one of the key metrics that they would have been looking to measure and looking to achieve. Particularly if you think about the Euros being a tournament in its own country, the visitation and the tourism that would generate would be one of the primary reasons, if not the primary driver, for a city looking to invest that much money in hosting an event. You've got to see the economic return to justify that level of investment. I think that the secondary driver of an event of this size and scale, obviously, is the media impact and the value that you're creating through broadcast and through viewership. And COVID probably impacts one of those more than the other. And I'd say, whilst some of these hosts still have visitors coming and still will be generating some economic impact, it's not going to be anywhere near what they would have expected when they first set out to host these games, originally. I think, with that international travel very limited, there will be a much greater focus on destination marketing and how you're using the platform of the matches that you've got, whether that's 3, 4, or 7, to really promote your destination, and to, I think, in this time particularly, show that you're open for business. We talked briefly before we came on that Hungary, Budapest, with those full stadiums of 60,000 people, it really shows, it's a kind of a snapshot of what normal life used to be like, and it feels very alien to us, but it also starts to show, well, actually we are open for business, and we're having our vaccine programs working, and we can see maybe some light at the end of the tunnel, and showing for these destinations to be able to demonstrate that they're handling the vaccine, but they're finding a way of kind of coexisting and putting on a tournament that's successful. I think that'll be quite critical. And I mean, although when I was thinking about this earlier on today, one of my reflections personally in terms of watching the games is that often you don't know where they're playing when you turn on, when you're hosting the whole tournament, it's say Euro 2024 and it's going to be in Germany, and all the matches will be in Germany. And obviously the host cities themselves will be wanting to position themselves and promote themselves. But there's a kind of clear identity around the tournament that is linked to that country that's hosting it. Whereas at the moment, feels like all of them kind of look the same, even though they're not. And
I mean, that's an interesting dimension to it, because if you think, when you do have a single host nation or a couple of host nations, smaller host nations, as the Euro had in 2008 and 2012, you do have a greater variety of venues as well. You will have smaller venues for some group games. You'll have older venues. You'll have, with a more traditional box shape. You might have very distinctive venues, and the elite venues, because they're built to a certain specification, tend to look quite similar on TV, apart from one or two architectural features that may or may not get in most of the shot. And I've noticed a couple of people just pick up on that casually And when you take the travel element out of it as well, that does become quite difficult to communicate, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that would be something that I don't know how much, and if I were, if it were me and I was hosting it, thinking in the lead up to it, it would be very much about how do we make this feel like St. Petersburg or Budapest or Wembley or Hampden Park? How do we make this feel like us so that we're communicating through the broadcast our city, our identity? And I think, that's the interesting thing about the tournament as a whole, is that the identity of this tournament is very much Europe. It's not the individual country. It's not necessarily even the individual city. It might be in some cases. And I guess one of the goals they had was to take the Euros to Europe and to take it to the fans and have it in places where more people can access the tournament and feel a part of it. But one of the outcomes that I would be thinking about in terms of destination exposure, media exposure, is not just how many people are watching, but who's watching, where are they from, and what's their perception of my destination as a result of what they've seen. And so, by watching Budapest, and I think of that as the example because it's the one that feels the most different, because you've got 60,000 people having a massive party. But what are audiences thinking about that? Does it make them more keen to go and visit? Does it make them more keen to live, more keen to invest, more keen to engage with Budapest as a destination? And so that's the kind of thing that I would be wanting to really understand and measure is has my hosting of this event changed the perceptions of those people that have seen us through that lens?
And there's a layer of complexity when it comes to Budapest politically that we'll come back to when we look at this from the other side. But just on the point about COVID, which hovers over the entire thing, and I think very much has restricted some of the ideas that cities might have had in terms of how they were going to project themselves. Certainly undermines the concept of the tournament in one way, which is that I am sure part of what was conceived was people getting trains, getting planes around the continent, taking in 3-4 different countries, rather than kind of doing all that travel within one country. But what are we learning from this tournament about the value of staging events in this hybrid era? And we don't know how long this is going to go on for, but certainly the rest of this year, probably a decent part of next year, there will be restrictions on the fluidity of travel, if not the possibility of travel, whether that's vaccination passports, quarantine restrictions, or circulation restrictions, whatever that might be. It could be going on for 18 months or longer. We really, really are completely in the dark about this, and some of the spontaneity will be taken out of the events. And for a host city, I suppose it means you have to think a bit more carefully about how you construct your offer in that time.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, because I think there's probably two layers of this. One is around operational delivery, and the second is around engagement. And on the operational delivery side, I'm probably thinking of two aspects. One is the tournament itself and the players and the teams within it, and maybe this is more from a UEFA perspective, but what do you do if someone gets COVID in one of the teams and they built in, you can have extra people in your squad, but then I'm sure English fans are wondering why Billy Gilmour, despite having tested positive, a couple of English players are having to isolate, but the Scottish team isn't. But in theory, you could make a fairly good argument that if one person in your team tests positive, there's a good reason for the whole team not to play. But you risk the whole tournament stalling because of that. I think the other issue, or the other thing that we're learning about how to manage, is how you manage a group of traveling people who are coming into a zone, your country, that you are controlling and placing regulations and rules on from a COVID sense. And this has been an issue, I think, in lots of different places with lots of different events. And it's not just events that are creating this tension, but cities and countries are learning how to flex, and they always have. They've always flexed. They flexed visa rules. They flexed, taxes and customs. They flexed a lot of things to enable major events to happen. And COVID is just one other thing that now is flexing to enable events to happen in a time where some people would think they shouldn't. But I think then I flip onto the other side, which is engagement. And what I think the Euros has demonstrated is that there's a huge pent up demand for events, whether that is live or just feeling part of something major that's happening that is different from your day-to-day life. And we're still seeing people, they're selling out the number of tickets that they have available. People are still prepared to go, and people are still prepared to take that risk because they want to engage in these events, they want to be part of it. And we've seen the noise in Wembley, despite only having a quarter of the capacity in there on Friday night, felt like you were watching real football again, without the sort of canned noise of Sky Sports. That has been great. And I think on that engagement point, it's the real importance of TV, social, digital as ways of engaging with the tournament and with people. I was pretty interested as well to see the number of people still traveling to London just to go there to be part of it, even though the event wasn't happening. And I mean, from a COVID perspective, it doesn't feel necessarily like the right thing, but it really goes to show that events, I think, will kind of weather this with some changes. And we've seen, there've been examples of hybrid event concepts like the WWE Thunderdome, where, people are there virtually, and those concepts really being quite successful commercially. But I suppose what this is showing is that you can still deliver, and people will still want to be hosting, they'll still want to be attending.
Yeah, I mean, the really definitive case study this year is going to be Tokyo 2020. And I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but where that is ordinarily the ultimate dive-in experience if you're a visitor, and if you're a participant, if you're a member of the media, everything is going on around you. I was talking to Tariq Panja from the New York Times a few months ago about this, and even then we were anticipating a much more on-rails experience for people who are traveling out to Japan. That will be true for the media. It will also be true for athletes, and of course there won't be any international fans. So the big selling point of the games, which is that you go and you really experience the city, is absent. But that won't necessarily be the same for every event, because not every event will have as many complicating factors as an Olympic Games has. So you might see one-off set pieces that are able to proceed as normal a little bit earlier than others. It's going to be there's going to be a lot of give and take, a lot of trade-offs, I suppose, in the next 18 months.
Yeah, and I'd be interesting to see how what happens after this, because so much of major events and major sporting events is about experience, and the experience that you have as a player, but as a fan and as an attendee. And most people who are around in London remember a time that they were at a London 2012 event, or remember a time, most people who work in sport remember a time that they were at a certain event, and what impact that had on them, what that meant for them. And it's that feeling that you're trying to recreate by being a part of it. And I think what this is demonstrating is that cities are prepared, hosts are prepared, and people are prepared to compromise to seek out those experiences that we haven't been able to have for so long. And I think if you take away that, then Tokyo is going to be a really interesting case study. If you take away the fans, if you take away that emotion of it, and you put that in people's living rooms instead, behind their TVs only, how does that impact the meaning of the sport and how meaningful it is for people?
You're listening to the SportsPro Podcast.
Let's go back to Euro 2020 and on the topic of compromise, we understand that after a brief bit of negotiating threat, or whatever it was, from UEFA, the semi-finals and final of the tournament are going to stay in London, but with an expanded capacity and with some as yet unconfirmed allowances made for VIPs and potentially for travelling fans as well. I mean, we can't go into the specifics of that too much yet because we don't know them, and I'm sure by the time people are listening to this, they will know a bit more. But what does that tell us about that malleability that you're kind of referencing there, and the fact that that there are going to have to be some modifications made almost on the hoof for the time being?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I probably say I'm not surprised, even though I probably am surprised actually that we're up at 60,000 spectators for semi-finals and final, although that is the capacity of Budapest, who was the other potential host of that game. So I can kind of see where that gets to. Where I'm a bit unsure, and I mean, by the time people listen to this, they should have a good understanding of who's going, who are those 60,000 people, and what does that mean in terms of ticket buyers and how they're coming into the country, and are they quarantining or self-isolating, and how does that work, and what's the impact on the country more widely? I think, to get to this position, either there is a view that the impact can be mitigated or managed, and that the impact from a COVID perspective won't be significant, or the perceived benefit or perceived benefit of hosting / perceived disbenefit of not hosting was not something that they wanted to do. And I can see why, if we're in where we're heading to now in the UK around coming out of COVID and looking like our vaccination program's working, and that soft power that I'd say the UK has probably been in the news for a lot of the wrong reasons over the last 2 years, and actually this is an opportunity to be centre stage for the right reasons, and to show that we've handled it. We've got a vaccination program that's worked, and here we are hosting the biggest sporting event at the moment in Europe. I can see why that has taken priority over maybe a more risk-averse, health-based approach.
Just it brings us back as well, again, to the multi-venue model that has been tried for these matches, and the fact that it's London and Budapest brings us back into another conversation that's been kicked off today, which is the row over the mayor of Munich wanting to change the lighting on the Allianz Arena. I know it's not known as the Allianz Arena for the duration of this tournament, but people will recognise that name. But wanting to put pride colours on the outside in response to some of the chanting and some of the banners that were seen in Budapest at the weekend, and to some legislation that's been that's made its way through government there. And UEFA's response has been not brilliantly received, to be generous, and perhaps not all that well conceived either. There's an inherent tension here, and it's perhaps something that wasn't imagined 10 years ago, 8 years ago when this was created. But you have an ever more authoritarian government in Hungary over the course of the last decade, and I suppose what it sets up is a debate about the viability of these events from a political perspective, which is that you have governments. You're dealing with one government, and there are topics you kind of broach and don't broach, and the rights and wrongs of that are for another day. But in this case, there is a tension between the political climate in Germany and the political climate in Hungary, and the expectations of the public in both of those countries as well, and certainly the expectations of leadership. So what again, does that undermine the potential of these sorts of events? Is it a dimension that rights holders are going to have to think about? How would you frame that particular concern?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think it has the potential to undermine in some senses. I suppose the question is, were Budapest not a host, would UEFA have made a different decision, or would they still have thought that it was a fairly bold move from Germany? If Germany had been doing it on a game that wasn't Hungary, would that have been an issue? Probably not. I think it was a bit of a flashpoint potentially.
It was quite a lawyerly manoeuvre, wasn't it, to say it's because it's been issued in response to this piece of legislation that we feel it's a political move. Whereas I think if that hadn't been the complaint, then perhaps they wouldn't have been able to use that get out.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm very much in favour of major events being used to promote positive messages and being used by the host or the rights holder to show what their values are and to show what they stand for. And I think that should be part of the platform that you have when you're hosting an event, provided that that those values align, the rights holder and the host. I think the challenge that we have here is that is that not all of the host values align. So you do get to that point of tension. Having said that, when we're looking at something like FIFA 2022 in Qatar, not all of the participating countries will agree with the decision to be going there, and they will not all agree with the values of the host. And there are many events that are hosted by countries and by hosts where there is a tension between those taking part and those hosting it. So I think it's not a new thing, but perhaps it has been exacerbated by the fact that you're trying to kind of keep two hosts happy at the same time, and inevitably you're going to disappoint somebody. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know whether UEFA, from a public perception perspective, made the right call. Time will tell.
Yeah, a bit of bravery might have gone a long way, but yeah, who's to say what conversations were had internally? Looking at the model, I know there were some comments made by Martin Callan and Alex Sefrin before the tournament began that were to the effect of, we wouldn't have done this if we hadn't already been dealing with host contracts and so on before we arrived. But what will success look like for UEFA, both in terms of the period that we're at with the pandemic and the fact that it couldn't have been a full-scale tournament, and the model that the tournament's been organised under, with these 11 countries involved? What would a successful tournament be in their eyes, do you think?
So getting to the end of it without any further incidents or a major COVID outbreak would probably be success. No, I mean, all seriousness, I think, notwithstanding COVID, cost of delivery still has to be a factor for them. And I think looking at the model as a whole and the cost and resource and hassle implications of this model, I think would have to be considered, and you'd really need to do a sensible cost benefit analysis of it. And of course, there are going to be some COVID related costs that you would have had to incur, regardless of whether it was in a one place or a multi-city model. But I'd be really interested to understand, both from a UEFA perspective, did it cost them more or less to deliver this? Has it cost them more in terms of cash, more in terms of people, hours, more in terms of logistical headaches and challenges than a single territory or sort of small combined territory model? And secondly, from a host perspective, on a one-to-one basis, I think success is all of those hosts feeling that they got good value for their investment, and did they benefit in a way that was proportionate to what they invested, cognizant, of course, of the COVID climate. I mean, I would also be interested to understand if those 11 cities' budgets would be the same as what a single host would have spent. Does it collectively cost those hosts more than it would cost a single host? I think probably, but that would be my expectation. But then, having said that, if everybody is comfortable with what they've invested and what they've got out of it, then it probably doesn't matter so much, rather than being in a situation where you've invested a huge amount of money in infrastructure that you don't need, or that doesn't have a longer term purpose. And I mean, the other aspect that they would have to think about, maybe less of an issue because of COVID, is the environment and sustainability and travel, and has that been increased or reduced? And possibly in some cases it's been reduced. I'd say, England fans, for example, won't have to travel to go and see England. They may have to for one or two games, but the likelihood is, depending on how many games England play, as a Scottish supporter over here, so I will stop there before I say anything too controversial. But yeah, so actually some fans will be travelling a lot less than they would otherwise.
I did wonder why you were talking about the noise at Wembley on Friday. But
it was positive noise from my perspective. Yeah.
A lot of talk, just to round off this part of the conversation, there's been a lot of talk about this kind of exploded format as events get bigger, and there's also been a lot of speculation about how well it would work for a multi-sport games, for an Olympics in particular. Are there going to be sports that are just better suited to it? If you have multi-part events, generally, do they better suit having perhaps a devolved setup where you have a few different hosts sharing resources, Is it something that perhaps works better? I mean, particularly from that travel perspective, it's perhaps something that works better for an Olympics where you've got 24 different World Championships going on at once than a World Cup where you have one, and people are going to have to travel around and fans are going to have to follow teams and stuff. And how much realistically are we going to learn about the future viability of that style of event from this tournament?
Yeah, I can't see, in terms of replicating the model, I'd be very surprised if anyone else was looking at a model with 11 different countries, 11 different governments, 11 different political environments that they have to manage, or it would have been 12. But, if you think about travel and distance, these events are already in the calendar in some ways, where if you look at 2026 North America FIFA World Cup, where, the three countries involved in that. But even if it was just the US, the distances you'd have to travel to get from match to match are still vast. Same with Brazil, the huge distances, including traveling to places like Manaus. And whilst that was a one country model, I think the travel aspect was still a significant challenge. It's interesting when you try and think about this from Olympics, because my first thought was actually this is almost the perfect kind of event for it, because what it does is it utilizes the best assets that you've got in Europe, the best stadiums. You can handpick them and you can go, right, well, every match is going to be played at a great stadium. Every match is going to be played with some home fans, or most matches are going to have some home fans. They're going to have the support of the government, and nobody is having to invest money in infrastructure that won't then have a future purpose. But then I thought the other recent example that I could think of was the European Championships 2018, where Glasgow hosted most of it, but the athletics was in Berlin. And actually, I think that worked reasonably well for both, because there was no overlap of athletes, no overlap of delivery, no overlap of really very much, because it was effectively, we'll have one World Championship over here and we'll have the rest of them over here. And I think that worked well from a logistical perspective. But what I would, on the flip side, I would query whether the tournament can have that same level of identity, and has that same experience and feel about it. I mean, even we think, will London hosted the Olympics? Well, yes, it did, apart from the sailing. Well, Beijing hosted the Olympics. Oh, well, it did, yes, apart from the sailing. And these split models are actually more prevalent than maybe we've thought about, because there's just been small bits of them. I can't see a model where the Olympics is broken up into multiple different parts. I think bits here and there, are you going to find somewhere that can host surfing and everything else? Not necessarily, but I don't see necessarily an 11 or a big number of multiples tournament working that well in certainly in diverse areas. I think models where the countries are well connected, or have shared borders, have shared identities in some ways, and have cooperative relationships in any case at government level, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's something that distributes the cost in a way that makes it much more sustainable for the hosts, will probably be important. And I don't see that going away.
The other side of it is I suppose the demand side, and whether there's an appetite for more host cities to stage smaller, medium-sized events, which is effectively what we have in particularly the group phase of Euro 2020, is lots of hosts having pieces of the tournament. And UEFA want to spin off the Champions League final, potentially, reportedly, into a Final Four. We might see more of that kind of something where it's a week and it's a small number of venues and it's relatively light demand on infrastructure, and particularly new infrastructure. Could that be a part of this conversation going forward, that there's just demand in the marketplace for it, so rights holders have to respond to that? Or do the realities of event delivery kind of meet the theory of event concepts head on?
I think from a host perspective, you're right. It's about getting the bang for the buck. So you get an event with a mega event reputation, but a small event or medium event budget. So your kind of economic impact is probably not going to massively outstrip the investment you're making. But if you could be investing in a section of a bigger event versus something that is a smaller medium event in a sport that's maybe less popular, less global, less watched and attended, or an event that's less meaningful to people, whether it's that sport or not, then you might be making significant investment and not getting the same kinds of returns. So I can definitely see from a host perspective the desire to get involved. And we work with small cities and large cities and small countries all the time, and there's a desire to show that they can do it and to host something to sort of create a model for what small cities can do, and without having to have lots and lots of infrastructure that actually doesn't suit their needs. And I think when we're thinking, if we talk about events over the next 10, 15, 20 years, obviously the environment and sustainability and making sure that we're investing money in things that have a purpose and have a use and are the best thing for these cities and countries is going to be more important than meeting a rights holder's needs.
Okay, well, plenty to look out for. We're going to get a host country's perspective on Euro 2020. Tom Bassam has been in Scotland this week, and he sent back, of all things, an in-person interview. I can't remember the last time we had one on the podcast. He's been speaking to Paul Bush OBE, the Director of Events at EventScotland, about the value of Glasgow's Euro 2020 games, the impact of COVID restrictions on its plans and on elements like fan zones, how the tournament tees Scotland up for future events, and how the sports events industry is changing. That is coming up just after this.
Hello, I'm Matt Rogan. I've spent my career creating and scaling businesses in sports and entertainment, and now I'm talking to smart leaders inside and outside sport to get their ideas on managing change and building towards a better future. You can listen in on the Playbook podcast, a collection of candid, agenda-free conversations full of practical advice your company can work with. Get your new episodes right here on the SportsPro feed, and check out the rest of the series wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, if you could just talk me through the role of Scotland in Euro 2020, what you guys have been involved in, and but maybe if we start with the bid process and how it was envisioned then to how it looks now, and what the challenges have been since.
Well, like most major events, the Euros was a bid that was awarded 7 or 8 years ago. It was autumn 2014. Lots of fanfare in Geneva when we were delighted that Scotland and Glasgow and Hampden was confirmed as the host city for 4 matches. 3 group games and a round of 16. And I guess until probably 2 years ago, it was all systems go. Obviously, COVID hit. The whole focus and attention over the last 6 to 9 months, to be quite honest, has been how do we ensure the matches take place? And I think that's probably been the same for all. Initially 12 hosts, and that's now dropped. Obviously, two dropped out. We managed to work very hard with government to ensure that matches could take place with 25% capacity at Hampden, which is pretty much the norm as it's been around Europe. There's obviously been slight differences in places like Hungary, particularly with Budapest, where they've been at full capacity. But generally speaking, they've been 25-30% capacity around Europe. And our investment in terms of working with the city in Glasgow was to look at fan zones. Originally, there was fan zones planned all over the country. They were pulled back, obviously, with COVID, and we now have one fan zone which is based in Glasgow Green. Was going to be in George Square, but again, because of social distancing and numbers, it was moved to a much more spacious environment. So in Glasgow Green, we have 3,000 fans per session. It's a space that can take 81,000 people. So Transmit, which is Scotland's biggest music festival, is held there on a regular basis. And it's been really successful. It's allowed people to come together to watch matches, not just Scots watching Scotland. There's lots of diasporas here. So you've had Poles, some like, and Austrians and Germans all watching their own team. And we've been blessed with relatively good weather. So it's been a really coming together. Tables have been socially distanced. People have been sat at the table. People have to wear masks to go in. There's high sanitation levels. So overall, I think it's been a real asset to run alongside operating the matches at Hampden.
So the original plan was for how many fan zones?
Well, it was 4 or 5. We were looking at Aberdeen, Dundee, Stirling, Perth, etc., Edinburgh, and then obviously scaled back because of COVID into the one location.
And then in terms of just as an event organiser, what do you have to put on in order to make sure that you get the accreditation to host that many people in a single event?
Well, I think around the fan zones, the biggest thing was to give the confidence to public health clinicians and ministers that actually it would be a COVID secure environment, and any exemptions that were required in terms of, you know, the COVID rules were actually going to be complied with as firmly as possible and adhered to, because Glasgow has been in a level 3 for some period of time. It's now in level 2. So it's that confidence not just for the people going, but confidence for people within society. And generally the feedback's been really positive.
How important is it to give off that positive kind of momentum, I guess, at kind of time when society's opening back up again?
I think it's absolutely critical and fundamental that we've got to start to get some confidence back into society and start to get back to doing things that we did previously, within the structures and systems that we're working in. So I think it's very much a graduated process. It's going to be about building that momentum, building that confidence over the next few months, you know, and dare I say years, because I do think it's going to take some time. I mean, the UK is in a very good position in terms of the vaccination process, but, you know, other parts of the world are going to take a long time to catch up. So international travel is still going to be challenging for many years to come.
And in terms of like what this does as an events industry for Scotland, what's the Euro? What is it? Does it elevate you slightly, or does it kind of just keep your momentum going as a kind of event?
I think it does both. I think it certainly shows the rest of the world that we're open for business. You know, that we want to get back to where we were. You know, I mean, Scotland's known as a great events host and destination. Scotland, the perfect stage. Glasgow is a great city, you know, having hosted Commonwealth Games and European Championships in 2014, 2018. You know, I think everyone recognised at every part of the process and every part of the journey that not having Euros in Scotland, whilst could have been a scenario, would have been a very, very unpalatable pill to swallow. So actually working as hard as people did to get to where we've got to has been really important.
What's next on the sort of objectives list with you guys with regards to sports events?
Well, our next big project is another uniquely different ones. I mean, we obviously, you know, a lot of people take golf for granted because we're the home of golf and we have such great golf events. You know, this year we've got this amazing field at the Scottish Open in a few weeks' time, the Women's Scottish Open here at Dunbarney, and then up to Carnoustie for a major in the women's game. But in 2023 we've got the first ever combined cycling world championships in Scotland, which is a really fascinating proposition. 13 world championships over a 2-week period, anything between 6,000 and 8,000 competitors, so it's huge. It's bigger than the Commonwealth Games. Over 100 countries will be competing here, 200 world champions, but with a massive also CSR human interest agenda. So that you know, there's a parallel universe in 2023 with the World Championships. We have to deliver 13 great World Championships on time and on budget, but it also provides us with a phenomenal opportunity to look at how we get people more active, more often, riding to work, the whole sustainability and environmental agenda. So that was the catalyst for the funding from Scottish Government and also from UK Government, as to can we make a real change and a real difference in some key areas. So we've not quite decided what those focuses will be yet, but over the next 6 months leading up to COP in November in Glasgow, we'll be looking at what are the 2 or 3 key deciding things that we want to do for Scotland and Scottish communities. You know, and community cycling festivals in every part of Scotland on one weekend every year. You know, so we close cities down and people can go out with their families and ride bikes and go shopping and have coffees and teas and breakfast. So it's quite a mindset change. I think it's the way forward events have to run, because I think, you know, purely linking into the economic impact or international profile agenda, I think those days have gone. I think the policy agenda is now really important, and how you link into the whole community, social cohesion, environmental sustainability agenda is going to be critical, particularly if you want to secure funding from different sources.
Yeah, I think that's something that actually applies across the whole of the sports industry, is this idea that you have to have, everything you do has to have a purpose.
Yes.
So is that really, like with all events now, that there's got to be that kind of message built into what you guys are doing?
Absolutely. I mean, short term, it's getting the industry back up and running. Number one priority. And that's not at all cost. But you know, the policy agenda is probably slightly on the back burner because we've got to give the confidence to people to start to get back and running. But in the big mega events, which I think Cycling 2023 is, and Euros, you know, what difference in addition to hosting the event will it make? And I think, you know, I hate the word legacy personally. I'm not sure it actually does what it says on the tin. But you know, can you make a lasting difference or a lasting change to that geography or society that's within that environment that you're hosting the event? And I think that's really important moving forward, because sustaining funding otherwise for major events will be very tough.
Am I right in thinking this is the first joined up Cycling World Championship? What are then the kind of the unique challenges of kind of creating a completely new event that's never existed before?
Well, there's pros and cons. I mean, nobody's ever done it, so you're not being compared with anybody else. You're creating, you know, your own particular benchmark with a blank piece of paper. I think the other thing which was really interesting, this came out of a breakfast discussion at Sport Accord in Bangkok with David Lepatier, the UCI president. His vision was to combine the World Championships, having seen what happened with the European Championships in Glasgow in 2018, and the catalytic impact it had on viewing figures, both on linear and streaming services. So, you know, if you talk to the EBU or BBC, they saw a significant impact by combining a range of sports into a package, similar to a Commonwealth Games or an Olympic Games. Apparently, the human being likes to watch package sport rather than solo sport. If you're watching football, you tend to be a football fan. But if you're watching package sport, you're not necessarily a fan of those sports. So bringing them together was his vision. It was a negotiation, not a bid, which I think is the way international rights holders will probably start to go. And I think you've already seen that with the IOC with Brisbane. It's been a negotiation, not a bid. And I think that's refreshing. It also gives us the opportunity to break the mould in terms of delivery. So, you know, I've been a strong advocate for a long time that major mega types events, which World Championships will be in 2023, have become too expensive. So can we look at economies of scale and synergies? You know, can we bring in partnerships better? Do the overlay costs have to be what the overlay costs are? You know, so it's shaking the tree a little bit, you know, which is painful, but hopefully long term that will give lots more benefits for sport and rights holders in sports as well.
Join the conversation with the SportsPro community. Follow us on Twitter @SportsPro and @SportsPro Events. Find us on Instagram @sportspro.media and connect to SportsPro Media on LinkedIn, where you can also become a part of our specialist OTT community. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
All right, that is it for another SportsPro podcast. Thanks to Tom Bassam and to Paul Bush for their time just then. Thank you to Kirsten Sibbit-Johnston.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks to all of you for listening. We will be back with you again very soon. Bye-bye.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.